This is episode 91 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. On this week's interview show, I am joined by Daniel Turner. He is the founder and executive director of Power the Future, an organization that works on energy issues nationwide and right here in New Mexico. Daniel, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Paul, thank you for having me back. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think the last time we talked, you and your organization had just rolled out your efforts here in the Land of Enchantment. You have continued to ramp things up, and now you have, I guess, an exciting announcement to make. And I'll let you do that, but why don't you make that quick announcement and talk about what Power the Future does and what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be with you and talk about the organization, and really grateful you allowed me to be on your program a year ago, because we were really just born. We just had our 1-year anniversary, and I started this organization to shed some light on the tactics and the political agenda of the radical environmental movement. It's amazing how when you claim to do things on behalf of the earth or for the good of the environment, you are given this wide berth to destroy people's lives, pass some radical legislation, etc. And the Green Movement is never held to task for what they actually believe and what they do to the economy and to rural America. So I started this group for that purpose. And after just a year, we've gotten some great support. We've gotten a lot of small dollar donors. And I've been able to hire someone full-time just for the state of New Mexico and the West. He actually focuses on New Mexico and Colorado, but he lives in New Mexico. His name is Larry Behrens. He was with the previous governor's administration for many years. He's from New Mexico. He's a former journalist. He loves the state. He's raising his 5 kids in the state. So it makes me really happy to have someone who is proud to be a New Mexican and who wants to help shed some light on the importance of the energy industry and push back on the radical environmentalists.
No doubt about it, and I appreciate that. And energy is, of course, a big issue. It's something we talk a lot about on the podcast, and there's a lot of different issues, and we're going to get into, of course, some here in New Mexico, but some as a national organization that you work with different folks on and trying to educate people about some of these issues as they pertain to New Mexico, even if they're not happening right in New Mexico. And of course, President Trump and his administration has been pretty darn solid on most energy issues. And, maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you see the national discussion going on energy before we bring it into New Mexico and then take it back out to some of the policies that are being proposed by whether it's the state of New York, city of New York, or presidential candidates. So kind of quick review, what has the Trump administration done on energy policy, especially as it pertains to folks out here in the West?
The best thing President Trump has done, which he does not get nearly enough credit for, especially from people who believe in free markets, is he has allowed free markets to operate. He hasn't done anything radical in terms of energy production, right? He didn't pass any sort of crazy new energy proposal or agenda. He took away thousands of regulations and he allowed the private sector to do what it does best, right? Look at the energy boom that we're experiencing in the southeastern part of the state along the Texas border, the Permian Basin, as well as other states that are experiencing the similar energy revolution. And again, it's not some magic formula. You don't need government to tinker in industry for industry to work. You need industry to be left alone, and it will flourish, it will thrive, it will grow, it will respond to consumer demands. And when you look at energy as a global commodity, because it is, right? We are on global energy markets. Look at the turmoil in Venezuela. Look at the turmoil in Iran. The Middle East is still the Middle East. And yet, even though, for example, gas prices have gone up in the last couple of weeks, they're still relatively low compared to the entire course of the Obama administration. Energy dominance, as the president calls it, allows us as a nation to continue our economic growth regardless, or as my Brooklyn family would say, irregardless of what is happening in the rest of the world. And that's an amazing position to have, a position of leverage and strength. And that's been great to see these last 2 years.
Yeah, and of course, we often in New Mexico focus on oil and gas production, and Southeast New Mexico, especially nowadays, is really driving that discussion. But another major area is in utilities and electricity generation. Folks often in New Mexico kind of put that as second fiddle. But this past legislative session and the passage of the Energy Transition Act really put electricity generation front and center. But before we get to that, Trump did do some good in terms of electricity generation, freeing states from Obama era regulations under the Clean Power Plan. Anything specific on that? It seems like a lot of states are going down the path like New Mexico of these renewable mandates and whatnot, but at least states now have the choice, and you'll see how it shakes out in the wash, and the federal government won't be as involved in electricity regulation. It'll be up to the states. Is that kind of your read on the situation, or anything on that issue?
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're absolutely right. That is something that the Obama administration imposed on the states, disrespecting the 10th Amendment. Right? States have autonomous rights, especially when it comes to electricity production. And look, this is where my organization and most free market thinkers agree. We need an all of the above energy solution because hydropower works in certain states, probably not New Mexico, right? But it does work in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest. It works very well in New England. Vermont has a lot of hydropower. Bernie Sanders prides himself on Vermont having a fracking ban. There's nothing to frack in Vermont, right? So these states have to be free to choose what electricity works best, whether it's oil, gas, coal, and even renewables, as long as the renewables aren't subsidized by the taxpayers. And that's the problem with your Energy Transition Act. When you start getting into government subsidies, you just skew all the markets and true costs.
Right. So talk a little bit about the Energy Transition Act. What is your take on that issue, and how is it going to impact New Mexico's economy in the years ahead?
Even the legislators who proposed it don't know how it's going to impact. I think people who don't understand how energy markets work look at it like a diet. And they say, all right, I'm eating too much red meat, and red meat is quote unquote bad, so I have to eat more fish. And so they say too much of our electricity runs on gas and coal, and that's quote unquote bad, so we need to find something else. The problem, which your state, New Mexico, is going to discover really soon when this gets implemented, there isn't anything else right now. To say, well, we want to transition our energy to renewables or to clean energy or no carbon emissions, that's great. I want to fly, right? But aspirations are not policy. And yes, New Mexico does have some wind and it does have some solar, but we're talking about minuscule percentages. And when you have powered cities like Albuquerque, where are they going to get their electricity from? And the fact that the legislators, your main utility company, kind of shrugs and says, well, I guess we'll worry about that closer to the 2030 deadline. You're jeopardizing industry, jobs, the economy, and quite frankly, lives by just shrugging your shoulders and saying, we'll figure it out.
And you, in your release on this, call it New Mexico's version of the Green New Deal. And we can talk a little bit about what the Green New Deal is, but do you see just massive price increases? And when do you think we'll see that really start to bite? I mean, obviously it starts being implemented here in 2020. Is it going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years? Any idea when we'll really start to see the impact of this legislation?
Yeah, I did an editorial board with the Albuquerque Journal, and they asked me the similar question, and I said, quite honestly, I don't think it's actually ever going to get implemented because just having a basic understanding of how politicians work, being in D.C. too long, I guess I've learned a dirty trade. But I see this as something where down the road, the adults in the room are going to say, okay, this does not going to work. There will be some sort of repeal, and the political consequences will never be borne by the people who pushed it. The governor will be out of office, the legislators will be out of office, and people will not suffer the political consequences. But in that short term, yes, I think within 2 years, 3 years, you're going to start seeing increase in prices and utility prices, or you're going to start seeing rolling blackouts. Case in point, the major cities of Australia. Their last prime minister, Malcolm Turnbull, passed something very similar. Australia is a heavily coal dominant economy. They have a tremendous amount of coal reserves and they power their electricity on coal. And he said, no, we want a green economy. And within a year, Sydney, Melbourne were having brownouts. And the citizens said, we live in the first world in Australia. Why is our electricity failing half the time? Because there is not a technology to just say, let's transition to green. And sadly, that could happen in Albuquerque. You could start seeing fluttering lights. You could see rolling brownouts. Look at Los Angeles. People may remember last year, Dodgers Stadium had 2 or 3 brownouts because Los Angeles's power grid is tinkering on collapse because of their energy mandates. So there's going to be some suffering before some changes happen.
I will just state for the record that my dear producer, Wally, who has engaged in work in the utility sphere, is in the same boat as you are in saying that it will never be completely implemented. So you're not alone here in making that statement about the Energy Transmission Act not being completely implemented. And of course, we'll see how it goes. Adults in the room is an implication that there are adults to be had in New Mexico public policy spheres. And I haven't really seen that in my time in New Mexico, but I'm willing to be surprised. You also note that New Mexico families already pay more for electricity than neighboring states, except for Arizona. Yeah, I've looked at the rates paid for electricity across the country, and it's one of those things that no doubt electricity prices have a big impact on family budgets and bottom lines, and also businesses and where they locate. But it's also very fraught to figure out what really impacts electricity prices across state lines unless you look at it over time. Is that something that you've looked at? I mean, it's certainly, we've seen New Mexico's electricity prices have gone up in recent years as the 20% renewable mandate has gone into place.
Yeah, and we've compared this to multiple states because we have to emphasize to our audience, to the American people, that this is what happens when you let green policies just have unfettered access to the governor's office and to the legislature, because these are feel-good pieces of legislation that people go home and they are very happy about. And they say, we are going to save New Mexico. We're going to save the earth. Like I said in my intro about Power of the Future, when you do something on behalf of the environment, you are given a very wide berth. But in reality, you need to look at things like utility costs. You need to look at gas prices in a very similar index, right? In terms of a real consumer cost that is driven in part by market forces, but in part by taxes and mandates. Governor Newsom in the state of California wants to hold investigations on why oil prices are so high. I'm sorry, gas prices are so high. And he says we have the highest gas prices in the nation. We need to have an investigation. How about you look at your taxes? Like, look at the mandates that you have put on refineries to come up with multiple forms of gasoline. All of this costs money. Every regulation costs money. There's no reason for an investigation. You made gas prices that expensive, you being the government. And the hopefully people in New Mexico begin to see that. Why is my utility bill 15% higher in 2021 than it was in 2019? because of this law, because of this regulation. Regulation comes with a price, and we need to stop having children, political children, make policy decisions because they are detrimental to the economy and to people's way of life.
Well, political children, that's something that, again, hits home here in Albuquerque because we were just at City Council fighting against a ill-advised plastic bag ban. And that particular policy was driven by, at least apparently, a group of children who went down to City Council and managed to tell and convince City Council. They're progressive leftists anyway, so it really wasn't hard to convince them. But really, children were the driving force in helping to pass this plastic bag ban, even though the policy on that will likely harm the planet overall.
And people have been, the left has been using children for their political purposes frequently. And when it comes to the environmental issue, they're having great success. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, you and your listeners may remember an episode where Senator Feinstein from California, her office was bombarded by a bunch of children demanding she sign on to the Green New Deal. And you heard the real fear in these children's lives. You know, they're only 10 years old, and they really believe the world is going to end if we don't do something, because obviously their moronic teachers, or maybe in certain cases their moronic parents, have convinced them. And that's a horrible – I'm not a parent myself, but good Lord, what a terrible thing to do to your children, to indoctrinate them with this liberal nonsense. Bag bans. The straw ban was led by a bunch of children. And now we have plastic straw bans all over the country, especially on the West Coast, because a bunch of school children read something in a book about animals dying because of straws in the water. 95% of the plastic pollution in the water comes from China and Indonesia and Malaysia. Why don't they go over there and make them ban plastic straws, right? Why don't they ban plastic bans? These groups all throughout New Mexico, like San Juan Citizens Alliance and the Rio Grande chapter of the Sierra Club, if they really cared about pollution, they would go to China and Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and set up shop there, but they don't. They persecute the people of New Mexico and America with their nonsense.
Yeah, no doubt about the children. I have 3 children myself, and some of the rhetoric and scare statements of kids at the Albuquerque City Council was very, very saddening to hear that kind of thing because, really, we all know that the data shows that the globe is getting cleaner and the world is better off today than it was before, decades before in terms of overall pollution. And yet these kids are being pumped full of disinformation from either the education system, the parents, or both, and it's really frustrating. So
yeah, and they claim to be the party of science, right? You hear that a lot from the left. We believe in science. There was a rally here in D.C. after Trump was elected about the rally for science. Well, that's a scientific fact. Emissions in the United States has gone down. I mean, if you even want to argue that CO2 is a pollutant, but you can say it is emitted. CO2 emissions have gone down over the last couple of years. Why doesn't the party of science celebrate that, right? Why don't they put that on their headlines and say, great news, America, we're winning the war on CO2, but they don't. So they pivot to something else. They have to have you believe we are in a constant state of doomsday scenarios. So again, a lot of the climate change stuff, a lot of the environmental stuff is not science, it's politics.
Well, if you can listen closely, dear listener, to Daniel, you might notice that he is from New York City, not from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I hate to say it, as bad as New Mexico politicians are on a lot of these issues, many in the progressive movement understand that New Mexico's bread is buttered by the oil and gas industry that really makes our economy go, and those folks also like to spend money. But so many of the bad ideas, and Daniel's banging up pretty good on the left coast and California, but New York has more than its share of wackadoodle ideas. And of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is leading the charge. I'm getting there on her pronunciation. But now we've got the mayor, Bill de Blasio, trying to ban hot dogs. Now, this is where I draw the line in the sand. I mean, we're hitting in the summer season. I'm actually going to a Albuquerque Isotopes baseball game here later tonight, and it's almost as bad as banning apple pie, but he's actually doing it. So talk a little bit. He's also against tall buildings, which is, just read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, some other things. It's just amazing what's coming out of New York City. So with that big window open for you, talk a little bit about what's happening up there.
Yeah, when you go to the baseball game, I am sure you can get a soy hot dog that tastes just as good, right? The the mayor of New York, it is amazing that there is no issue where he is not an expert, be it nutrition, be it architecture, be it sustainability in engineering. When it comes to climate change or when it comes to the environment, you are given a very wide berth to do anything. So he wants to regulate the school children's diets because of climate change, and that means no more meat on certain days or processed meats, especially. He wants to have, I think it was only 1 day a week he wants the school diet to allow meat, and otherwise it will move to plant-based because this will be good for the environment. And he has talked about on Earth Day, just last week, he proposed the ban on high rises because he said the glass and steel skyscraper is the leading cause of climate change, and New York has quite a few skyscrapers, and he does not want them built anymore. And you want to look at these people outside of my issue, which is climate and environmental and energy issues, outside of the multiple issues where your organization is just an expert on. Just think of like the step above all that to the philosophy. Who the heck does the mayor of New York think he is that he says, I will determine what your children eat. I will determine the types of building that can be built. I will determine how you get to and from work, right? This is a man who has closed down entire blocks of New York and opened them up to bicycles because that is his preferred mode of transportation, though he, of course, takes an SUV Caravan.
Well, I want to jump in on that real quick, Daniel, to interrupt. We could rant for a while on this one, but on the skyscrapers, and I realize, folks, you're listening out there, you're thinking, even in Albuquerque City Council or Santa Fe, they wouldn't do something as dumb as ban hot dogs. But these ideas in our society percolate, and it's almost like reverse Darwin, the survival of the stupidest. They come back and keep coming.
Yeah.
But just on the environmental aspect alone, high rises, as I have understood them, are the most green buildings you can build because you can actually make mass transit work. And you're from that area, you probably know better than I do, but I've spent time in New York. You actually have a subway system that makes sense, unlike Albuquerque, where if you come here, the Rail Runner or the bus system in Albuquerque or the ART, which doesn't even work, it's not even functional. The mass transit is not useful in a spread out place like this. Whereas in a highly dense urban area, you're losing the need for automobiles, and people can actually bike to work and make it a sensible part of their daily commute. So talk about that aspect of New York life and the environment within New York City.
Yeah, and you're right. If everything worked the way it's supposed to, and that means the subways working and buses working, but when government is in control of all of the utilities and transportation systems, when they fail, people need alternatives, right? The New York City subway system has been in decline the last 10 years, so people are driving to work now, and so you couple that with lane closures because of bike lanes, and now there's congestion in the city. So what does the mayor propose? A congestion tax, and now there'll be a new tax for cars on the road during rush hour in Manhattan, right? But you're right. If things work the way free markets would allow them to, I mean, people move to New York for a reason. It could be totally green. You wouldn't need a car. A lot of Manhattanites don't even have them. When it's people trying to get to work that do. And what he also he struggles to realize is every high rise is revenue. It's someone renting the space. It's someone doing business in the space. It's someone buying it. Maybe if it's residential, and they're paying taxes. So he looks at a high rise as something that is bad for the earth, whereas he should look at the high rise and say, this is where I will get revenue to run the city. But he doesn't see the world that way because he's a lefty.
I've got it. I actually think that de Blasio has Trump derangement syndrome to such an extent that because Trump is a New York guy who builds skyscrapers, that he wants to ban them. That's my conspiracy theory. You can take it to the bank.
It's a great point, because there's really no other logical explanation to just decide to ban the high rise. Is there anything more quintessentially American in terms of architecture? I mean, we invented it. Anyone who's read that wonderful book, Devil in the White City, the skyscraper was invented in America. Other people have built bigger ones now. Kudos to them. But they are not progressive. Here's what I'm stammering to get to. Do not let the left, do not let the environmental movement call themselves progressive, because this is not progress. They are regressive, and that is a huge distinction.
Right. And I just want to add a few quick things. I spent my time on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. In that area. The D.C. Metro is also in need of massive talking billions of dollars in infrastructure. I know New York subway, despite its relatively cost-effective nature, given most transit systems, it does require the New York City is probably taking those taxes off of automobiles. I know they take bridge fees, like the tolls over the bridges, and dump that into the transit system. So these systems, even when they operate kind of as they should in a big, densely populated city like New York, they're still heavily subsidized by the taxpayers, and in this case, motorists.
Absolutely. And an interesting thing about the subway, just to give a fun analogy to go back to renewables, because the left loves to talk about renewables. We did an analysis. New York City's subway requires, it was 1.8 billion kilowatt hours of electricity to operate. 1.8 billion kilowatt hours. The largest solar farm in the nation, which is right now in Southern California, it's called Topaz Farm. It only produces 1.2 billion kilowatt hours electricity. So the largest solar farm cannot power New York's subway. Now let's add in a little kicker. The largest solar farm is 4,000 acres. That is 5 times the size of New York's Central Park. So under AOC or Bill de Blasio's desire to be a green city, basically we need to take the entire state of Connecticut and turn it into a solar farm. And then maybe we could run New York City, the subway included. There's just no land for solar. But again, these are the questions that children politicians are never asked. Where is the land going to come from? Plus, is New York as sunny as Southern California? Where are we building the turbines? For all I know, the East Coast, where I am from, has shunned turbines. Maryland has rejected them because they're unsightly. Hyannisport, where the Kennedy compound live, they led the charge to stop the wind turbines because they're unsightly. So again, where are we getting all this renewable energy to power New York City? It's just circular reasoning with a bunch of children.
Perhaps New Yorkers just don't like Connecticut to the point where they want to pave over it with solar panels. I think that might be the politicians, certainly. I know a lot of the wealthiest people in New York commute in from Connecticut, so maybe they want to keep their money back in New York where they can tax it. And I don't know about the politics back there. Well, we got a few minutes left here, and we've got a rapidly expanding but very large field of Democrats running for the presidency. And, kind of all of this is looking through, people wonder why is everybody, on the right or wherever obsessed with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Well, she's setting the Democrat agenda, and the Green New Deal that she cooked up, so to speak, is really driving or evident in the policies being put forth by so many of the folks on the Democrat side who are running for president. So kind of lightning round, because I don't think we're going to get to all 20 of them. At least that's the last tally we have on presidential candidates from the Democratic Party. But each of these folks tends to come at energy from a pretty Green New Deal-y kind of direction. So I guess we'll go with the front runner, at least as he stands now, Joe Biden. So talk about Joe and his issues on energy.
Yeah, I have an op-ed that just ran on FoxNews.com yesterday, and it's about exactly Joe Biden. And he will try to convince the voters. I think he's giving a rally right now as we're talking in Pennsylvania. He will try to remind everyone he's just a guy from Scranton, right? He's a blue-collar guy just like you. Joe Biden was vice president during an administration that targeted coal in particular with a political vengeance we have never seen. 50,000 coal miners lost their jobs under the Biden Obama war on coal. Whole regions of Appalachia, look at Farmington, New Mexico, right? Whole coal regions that were once thriving communities were targeted politically. People say, well, fracking drove coal out of business. Nonsense. Regulation made coal expensive. Coal has been the cheapest source of energy since it was discovered. It is still the cheapest source of energy, but when you add regulations, when you add taxes, when you add all the EPA nonsense, they made it expensive and they drove it out of the marketplace, and that was their goal. How Joe Biden has the gall to run for president as a blue-collar man when thousands of blue-collar people lost their jobs under him, I will never understand, but we will call him out for it every step of the way.
Well, Farmington, New Mexico is a relative conservative bastion in northern New Mexico, and they probably don't like Joe for the double whammy there, not only the war on coal, but of course the power plant that coal in Farmington and the Four Corners fuels was also a direct victim of the Clean Power Plan that Obama put forth that was arguably set up for where it currently is with PNM and soon to be shut down by Obama, even though ultimately the shutdown will be done due to state rules and regulations. But we got to move on. Elizabeth Warren. Now, I try to stay away, quite frankly, from most national politics, but you say she wants to ban all fossil fuel development on federal lands. That is, you talk about a dagger at the heart of New Mexico. That one is really as close to the heart of New Mexico as you can get. Because unlike a lot of states, we're pretty heavily federally owned.
Yeah, and Alaska, multiple states, Colorado has a lot as well. You ask your average person, especially an environmentalist who feels deeply about this, what percentage of federal land is open to energy exploration? And I wouldn't be surprised if they said 50, 70, 90%. 0.1% of the federal land right now has energy exploration happening, energy production. 0.1%. And for Elizabeth Warren, that is way too much. Odd that we're talking percentages when she is 1,024th Native American. So I guess minuscule percentages for Elizabeth Warren are a very big deal.
Well, we have Native American tribes right here in New Mexico that have energy on their lands, and they're many of them are producing and selling it. So that'll be an interesting discussion should Elizabeth make her way into the White House. Heaven help us. Bernie Sanders, national fracking ban and a ban on exporting fossil fuels. Yes. Again, bad news for New Mexico right there.
The craziest of all of them. He wants to pass an absolute executive order, or he will issue an executive order banning fracking from his first day. We have over 1 million fracked wells right now in America. And I'm sorry, I don't care anyone who disagrees with me on this. If there were these scores of people falling ill to fracking, they would be on CNN every single day. We have 1 million fracked wells right now in America. Fracking is a perfectly safe and a very economically important industry. And yes, and then he wants to ban all exports of fossil fuels. We are finally exporting oil for the first time in decades, and he will reverse that. Way to go, Bernie.
And by the way, Daniel, you should know that our Democrat governor, who certainly has signed on to many of the regressive energy policies, to her credit, Michelle Lujan Grisham in Congress as a member of the House of Representatives did vote in favor of a standalone bill to allow crude oil exports. It, in my estimation, is the best single vote she ever took in Congress and probably the best thing she's done in politics so far in her lifetime. That bill was ultimately folded into a omnibus bill that Obama grudgingly signed. Obama said he would veto a standalone fracking ban. So I guess that puts Bernie well to the left of our own Governor Lujan Grisham.
Yeah, and who would benefit the most from a export ban of fossil fuels. Russia, which exports an awful lot of natural gas. Iran, which now just has new sanctions under this administration. They're trying to bring their exports of oil down to zero, but they would thrive, right? So why do we want to empower our enemies, these rogue nations who are our adversaries on the global sphere? Why would we empower them to export oil and gas at America's detriment? Again, just nonsense. Children politicians, Paul. They are children politicians.
I like that that line, children politicians. You're kind of like the whole drunken sailor thing. I have to say that you're giving children a bad name, however. So,
sorry, children.
Children of the world, it's okay, except for that Swedish crazy lunatic who has led these marches and all this stuff. She's genuinely disturbed child. The last is Robert Francis O'Rourke of El Paso, Texas. So kind of a neighbor here to us in New Mexico. Some people call him Beto. I don't know why he has this name, but Robert Francis O'Rourke has issued a $5 trillion, that's with a T, dollar plan to tackle climate change. And I know he ran for the Senate recently in Texas. Talk about Mr. O'Rourke's plans.
Yeah, what amazes me about Mr. O'Rourke is that when he was trying to win Texas running against Ted Cruz, he ran as a conservative Democrat. But now that he doesn't want to necessarily win Texas, he wants to win San Francisco and New York and D.C. and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He's unveiling all of these radical proposals. Where was he just 5 months ago when he was running against Ted Cruz? Where was a $5 trillion anti-oil and gas, pro-climate change agenda when he was running against Ted Cruz? So Mr. O'Rourke is as fake as his nickname. $5 trillion is more than our annual GDP. So I guess if we do nothing but spend money on climate change, I don't know what China's going to do. I don't know what India is going to do. If climate change is real, it is a global problem. We have not signed on to global accords, and yet we are reducing our emissions. So why are we punishing ourselves for what other nations are doing? Because children politicians.
All right. Well, we'll take that as the refrain of this interview. And Daniel, it's been a pleasure. Why don't you share with people how they can get involved, find out more about Power of the Future, and what can we do in our day-to-day lives and with these children politicians to make them a little more grown up about energy policy?
I'm just grateful to be with you and your listeners. I love the Rio Grande Foundation and the work you do. Our website is powerthefuture.com. Larry Behrens is your state director, so I'll give out his email, Larry@powerthefuture.com, or me, Daniel@powerthefuture.com. And for New Mexico, what we just love to hear are people who work in this industry, people who are targeted by the environmental left. We love to share their stories. We love to tell the importance of what the energy industry is doing, especially in a state like New Mexico, which last year saw record growth. And that growth was not a gift from heaven. It was not a miracle. It was hard work by thousands of men and women working in this industry, and investment and sweat and technology and ingenuity. And they deserve some respect. They deserve respect from your governor, from your land commissioner, and from the environmental left. And Power of the Future will fight for them every day. So thank you for letting me talk about that.
Thank you, Daniel, and I'm impressed that as a New Yorker, you got that accent on the E in our in the organization's name, because so many people, even here in New Mexico, say Rio Grande Foundation. I say at least I can go so far as to say Rio Grande Foundation. I don't roll my R's very effectively, however, in the Spanish. But thanks for coming on today, and folks, go check out Daniel's organization and make sure you get in touch with Larry Behrens and find out what Power of the Future is up to here in New Mexico, working on many of these same issues as the Rio Grande Foundation, trying to educate folks on energy and how it really makes New Mexico go. We are working hard every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.